Former Vice President Joe Biden is accusing President Trump of having morally bankrupt policies towards Latin America. In an op-ed in the Miami Herald, Biden accused the president of, quote, relying on vilifying immigrants to score political points while implementing policies that ensure asylum seekers and refugees keep arriving at our border. Biden also used the op-ed to lay out his own version of the nation's policies on immigration in Latin America if he wins the Democratic nomination and eventually the presidency. Julia Manchester joins me now from Washington. She's a reporter for The Hill, and here with me on set is our CBSN political reporter, Huey-Burns. Thank you both for being here. Caitlin, I wanted to start with you. What is Biden proposing in this plan?
Well, what's significant about Biden's plan is that he wants to address the root causes of why people are coming across the border from Central America. So he talks a lot about needing to expand resources in places like not only Mexico, but also El Salvador. And he really leaned into his experience as vice president. And I think this is really designed to be a preview of what we might see later on this week in the first Democratic debates, which are taking place in Miami. And that's significant because Florida, as we know, is a key battleground state, not only for Democrats, but for President Trump as well. He launched his re-election campaign in Florida just last week, and he's been focusing on immigration as a key re-election campaign issue, but also his policies on Cuba and Venezuela, really hoping to talk to that community, especially in Miami and South Florida, migrant populations there. So this is a way for Biden and other Democrats to go on defense here and also a little bit on offense as well by talking about immigration policy in Florida.
It's really not the first immigration plan we've seen from 2020 candidates already. Julian Castro calling for a Marshall Plan in Central America. So how does Biden's plan now compare to that?
Right. Julian Castro has a plan. Biden has a plan. Beto O'Rourke, who used to represent El Paso in Congress, which of course is a border town, came up with a plan. But what's significant to me is that we really haven't seen Democrats tackle this issue head on beyond a response to the president's current policy. So we've seen a lot of Democrats criticize the president, especially in light of this new reporting at the border, but they haven't really come up with their own policy proposals. So this is, I think, could be a turning point in the campaign where they are introducing these issues. I've talked to a lot of activists on this issue who say that Democrats at some point are going to need to come up with their own plan to be able to present to people instead of just criticizing the president. So I think we'll look for those questions in the Miami debate, just given how critical of an issue it is in that state.
Certainly. And we also heard from Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders announcing a plan today to eliminate every penny of student loan debt in the country, $1.6 trillion. Here he is announcing the plan on Capitol Hill today.
Our proposal, which costs $2.2 trillion over 10 years, will be fully paid for by a tax on Wall Street speculation, similar to what exists in dozens of countries around the world. The American people bailed out Wall Street. Now it is time for Wall Street to come to the aid of the middle class of this country.
A lot of supporters say that this is important to allow those who have now graduated college to actually get a jump start in the workforce. Julia, so how does this plan actually work?
Yeah, so essentially Bernie Sanders would plan to wipe out this debt by using essentially a Wall Street tax and taxing various payments through Wall Street and having essentially Wall Street pay for this. You know, this is something that Bernie Sanders has talked about for quite some time now, and it's really aiming at his progressive base. And it's interesting the timing that this plan come out. It comes on the heels of Elizabeth Warren's plan to relieve student debt, and it seems like this plan is a bit more comprehensive, involves a bit more detail, and that's interesting given the fact that Senator Elizabeth Warren has really laid out a lot of details with her various plans when she's been on the campaign trail. So I think the timing of this shows these two progressive candidates vying for that very progressive vote. Many of them are millennials or Gen Xers who are really struggling with student debt and trying to attract them.
So now we're 2 days away from the first debates of the 2020 election. Let's go ahead and move right now to Caitlin Huey-Burns, and we're talking about South Carolina. You were there last week. You saw almost all of the 20 candidates who will be on that stage. What stood out most to you?
Well, just the sheer number of them, really. This was the first time over the weekend that they were all in the same place, pretty much, all at one time. And it was really a lightning round because they only had limited amounts of time to speak to the audience on Friday night and, of course, also at the state convention the following day. And we're going to see a similar dynamic play out in the Democratic debates this week. There are 20 candidates spread over the course of 2 nights, so we have 10 on stage at each time. A lot of these candidates are trying to introduce themselves. A lot of them are already well known, Bernie Sanders chief among them, also Joe Biden, who have to make a case for their campaign. So we're going to be watching really whether people decide to go after the perceived frontrunner, which is Joe Biden, whether they decide to use the time to introduce themselves and focus on themselves, or how much they make this about their eventual opponent, the person they want to take on eventually, which is Donald Trump. I think this also could have the effect of winnowing the field a little bit. Voters I talked to in South Carolina were really overwhelmed by the number of candidates. They're ready for this field to shrink a little bit, and they're looking for the debate to help them make that decision.
Do you think that it is too soon to tell if maybe when they hit the stage they're going to be able to eliminate some people right off the bat?
Well, this is really going to be a test for a lot of these candidates who need to gain some momentum after this. We have seen the field develop into a couple of different tiers through polling, through fundraising, through voter feedback and interest. And so for some of these other lesser known candidates, I think they're going to have to make their case of why they are still in this race, what they have to offer, or else I think voters are starting to winnow the field themselves. And I think that will be reflected later this month when the fundraising quarter closes.
I know that you've been following this closely. Julia, you too, you've been digging into the debate field for Hill, and you've been there every step of the way. Walk us through what you should expect to see each night.
Yeah, so I think it depends what night you're talking about. I think on the first night with Elizabeth Warren, expect Congressman Beto O'Rourke to try to really stand out in that race. Elizabeth Warren has been able to make headway and separate herself from the rest of the Democratic pack by releasing all of these very in-detail plans and focusing solely on policy. This has been something Beto O'Rourke has been struggling to do, so we'll have to see if Beto O'Rourke kind of takes a jab at Elizabeth Warren's more progressive side, given that he does not have as progressive of a record as she does, and how he eventually stands out. On night 2, I think a lot of people will be focusing on Joe Biden versus Bernie Sanders. These two men representing two parts of the Democratic Party, really, Biden being the establishment member and Sanders being the more progressive member. But don't forget about candidates like Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg, who are very mid-tier candidates who have made quite a bit of headlines along the way. They'll want to jab at Biden and Sanders as well and try to differentiate themselves. And I think we saw Kamala Harris do that a little bit in South Carolina. You know, I was very struck by her 7-minute speech at the South Carolina Democratic Party event this weekend. Even though each candidate only had 7 minutes, I feel like she really stood out because she contrasted herself so well from President Trump. She made this comment essentially saying, you know, what does Make America Great Again mean, and kind of bringing in the racial aspects, if you will, of the race and the controversial racial comments that have been made by President Trump. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if Vice President Biden's recent comments on those former segregationalist senators, if he's asked about that, and it'll be interesting to see how the other candidates on stage respond to that, because it does give them a chance to really go after him on that.
Well, Julia Manchester and Caitlin Huey-Burns, you will be there every step of the way, and we'll be checking in with you as well. Thank you both for joining us now.
Thank you.